It is 2 o'clock in the morning. You are driving down a dark, seemingly endless stretch of highway somewhere in the American Midwest. Your fuel gauge drops below the red line. The low fuel light blinks. What do you do? Today, you just look for the glowing neon sign of a 24-hour gas station, pull in, swipe a card, and get back on the road in 5 minutes. But imagine for a second that it is 1948. That glowing oasis does not exist. If you run out of gas at night, your options are incredibly grim. You are either sleeping in your freezing car, or you are knocking on a stranger's farmhouse door praying they have some extra tractor fuel and a forgiving attitude. For decades, America had absolutely zero 24-hour gas stations. The entire country ran on a strict banker's schedule, locking up the fuel pumps the second the sun went down. So how did an entire nation of car-obsessed Americans survive the night? And what finally forced the lights to stay on? The answer isn't just about fuel. It involves a massive cultural shift, a desperate habit of hoarding explosives in glass jars, and a relentless 41,000-mile concrete web that completely rewired the American landscape. To truly grasp why finding fuel at night was completely impossible, you have to completely erase your modern understanding of what a road trip actually is. We view driving as a guaranteed utility. You get in the car and go wherever you want, whenever you want. The infrastructure bends to your schedule. But in the early days of the automobile, driving wasn't a necessity. It was a terrifying, messy, and incredibly expensive hobby reserved strictly for the wealthy. Let's go back to the turn of the century. By 1910, there were fewer than 500,000 cars in the entire United States, scattered across a massive, unpaved continent. If you owned one of these unreliable machines, you couldn't just pull up to a brightly lit roadside pump when the engine began to sputter. Gas pumps, as a standalone piece of convenient infrastructure, simply did not exist. So, where did you actually go to keep your machine running? You went to the local pharmacy, or perhaps you visited the town blacksmith or a dry goods store. Gasoline was not yet viewed as a dedicated transportation fuel. It was treated as a volatile chemical byproduct of kerosene refining, frequently sold in small batches as a cleaning solvent. When your primitive automobile needed a refill, you walked into a normal retail shop during daylight hours. You would purchase this dangerous chemical in a heavy 5-gallon square tin can. You then had to haul that sloshing container out to the dirt road, hoist it up, and carefully pour the fuel into your tank using a metal funnel. You did all of this while praying you didn't spill the highly flammable liquid over the hot engine block and blow yourself to pieces. Because these were standard local businesses, they operated on strict retail schedules. When the sun went down, the apothecary locked his doors, the blacksmith went home, and the town's entire fuel supply was literally locked inside a shed until the next morning. But then, the world shifted. As the 1920s roared to life and Henry Ford's Model T revolutionized manufacturing, the automobile was suddenly yanked out of the hands of the elite. It was dropped squarely into the driveways of the working class. The numerical growth is staggering. Vehicle ownership exploded from that mere 500,000 to over 26 million by the year 1930. The chaotic, tin can at the pharmacy model completely collapsed under this immense demand. America desperately needed dedicated infrastructure. This singular need birthed the era of the drive-in service station. But here is the part most people completely misunderstand about this golden age of early motoring. They were called service stations for a very literal reason. You did not pump your own gas. Doing so would have been considered socially absurd, and in many municipalities completely illegal due to strict fire codes. Imagine rolling onto a crushed gravel lot in 1928. The moment your tires crunch to a halt, a highly orchestrated ballet begins. A team of 2 or 3 young men wearing crisp uniforms, polished boots, and actual bow ties would sprint out from the garage to your car. While you sat comfortably behind the wheel, these attendants went to work. One man actively pumped the gasoline, carefully monitoring the mechanical dial. A second man popped the heavy steel hood to check your oil levels and inspect the fan belts. A third rapidly wiped down your windshield and meticulously checked the air pressure in all 4 tires. It was an intensely labor-driven business model designed to make the driver feel like royalty. Now, think about the pure economics of that specific setup. Why would a station owner ever keep the lights on after dark? Paying 3 grown men in bow ties to stand around in the freezing cold at 3 o'clock in the morning, just hoping a stray traveler might wander by, made zero financial sense. It was commercial suicide. Station owners were independent businessmen who treated their garages exactly like a neighborhood bakery or a local post office. They opened at dawn, they catered heavily to the daytime rush of local commuters, and they locked the heavy padlocks on the pumps at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. The unwritten rule of early 20th century American travel was thus set in stone. You plan your journey around the daylight, or you simply do not travel at all. The entire infrastructure of the country flatly refused to support night driving. Headlights of the era were practically useless glass bulbs that barely pierced the darkness. Rural roads were unlit, unmarked, and deeply treacherous. The mere concept of a nighttime road trip was considered something only a madman or a desperate fugitive would ever attempt. For a brief period, this delicate balance worked just fine. People respected the natural rhythm of the sun. But the American landscape was expanding rapidly. Suburbs were stretching out, cities were connecting, and the limits of daytime travel were starting to heavily chafe against a population eager to move faster and further. The rigid dawn-to-dusk rule was about to crack under the immense pressure of modern industrial life. And as drivers grew increasingly desperate to travel after the sun went down, they started taking matters into their own hands, setting the stage for a massive, deadly crisis on the dark roads of the nation. As the 1930s progressed, the rigid walls of this daytime-only world began to crack under the weight of human ambition. The American landscape was shifting rapidly. Cities were sprawling outward, early suburbs were forming, and a brand-new industry called commercial trucking was in its infancy. Now, if you are a trucker hauling freight across state lines, you do not make a single dime while your rig sits idle in the dark. Drivers needed to cover serious ground, and they were getting increasingly desperate to break the chains of the setting sun. This desperation birthed some of the most incredibly dangerous habits in the history of American transportation. People fully understood that the local service stations would firmly lock their pumps by dusk. So, if you had to drive at night, you had to bring your own supply. And remember, specialized, heavy-duty plastic jerry cans did not exist yet. Instead, drivers would fill up whatever they had lying around the house. They used glass mason jars, old ceramic milk jugs, and unsealed, flimsy metal tins. They would fill these makeshift containers to the brim with highly volatile leaded gasoline and simply toss them into the trunk of their cars. Picture this scenario for a moment. You are navigating a dark, poorly graded, unpaved rural route in a 1935 Ford. Your headlights are barely casting a glow 10 feet in front of the bumper. And sitting right directly behind your passengers, unsecured and sloshing violently with every single bump in the road, are 10 gallons of homemade explosives. What do you think happened when a driver misjudged a tight curve in the dark? Minor fender benders, The kind of low-speed crashes that would barely dent a modern bumper today routinely turned into horrific, deadly explosions. Families were literally incinerated on the side of the road, simply because they were trying to stretch their travel time a few hours past sunset. It was a macabre, terrifying reality of early road travel that the glossy car commercials of the era entirely ignored. But the danger of the night was not just chemical. It was deeply, systematically social. If you were a Black American traveling across the country during the Jim Crow era, running out of gas after dark wasn't just a frustrating inconvenience. It was a literal life-or-death crisis. In 1936, a postal worker named Victor Hugo Green published the first edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book. This legendary guide was designed to direct Black travelers to safe businesses, motels, and, crucially, friendly service stations. Here is the grim reality that even the Green Book could not fully solve. Even those designated safe haven gas stations had closing times. They operated on the exact same daylight schedules as everyone else. If a Black family miscalculated their mileage and found their fuel gauge hitting empty on a dark country road, they might find themselves stranded in what was known as a sundown town. These were municipalities where Black people were threatened with violence or arrest if they were found within city limits after the sun went down. Being trapped on the side of the road in an unfriendly, aggressively hostile town after the local station locked up was an absolute nightmare. For these drivers, securing fuel before dusk was not a matter of scheduling. It was a strict matter of survival. Why would anyone willingly risk their life just to drive at night? You might think this mounting pressure, the explosive trunks, the desperate truckers, the societal dangers would immediately force the gas station industry to adapt and turn the lights on. But just as the demand for nighttime fuel reached a boiling point, history slammed the brakes. In December 1941, the United States entered World War II, and the entire domestic economy was violently turned upside down. Gasoline was no longer a civilian commodity. It was a critical military asset. The federal government, through the Office of Price Administration, instituted strict, nationwide rationing. Suddenly, you couldn't buy gas even if you had the money. You were issued a sticker for your windshield. Most average civilians received an A sticker, which strictly dictated your legal allowance. For the vast majority of the country, this meant you were limited to a meager 3 to 4 gallons of gas per week. Pleasure driving disappeared overnight. Midnight joyrides were completely out of the question when fuel was heavily rationed and rubber tires were restricted for the war effort. You drove to work, you drove to the grocery store, and you went home. The strict system of daytime-only fueling was essentially frozen in place by a massive global conflict. For nearly 5 years, the American road at night was dead quiet. The pressure cooker was sealed. But when the war finally ended and millions of soldiers returned home, the entire country was about to step on the accelerator. The massive economic boom of the 1950s was looming on the horizon, bringing millions of shiny new cars to the streets. The demand for fuel was about to skyrocket to unimaginable levels, setting the stage for a bitter, violent clash between an industry that desperately wanted to sleep and a public that demanded the right to drive all night long. With millions of soldiers returning from the war and the explosive economic boom of the early 1950s kicking into high gear, the American highway was suddenly flooded with gleaming new automobiles. The suburbs were expanding at a breakneck pace, and the old dawn-to-dusk curfew simply could not hold. People were driving further, staying out later, and the demand for nighttime fuel reached an absolute fever pitch. But the local service station owners, mostly independent franchisees who valued their sleep, stubbornly refused to budge. A man running a local Texaco in Ohio was not about to ruin his health working a graveyard shift for an extra $10 in revenue. So, how did desperate drivers cope before the massive oil conglomerates finally gave in? The earliest solutions were incredibly clumsy and agonizingly slow. Independent mechanics and a few early towing outfits began offering what they called emergency fuel dispatch services. If your 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air sputtered to a halt on a pitch-black county road, you had to abandon your vehicle, hike through the dark to find a working payphone, and call an emergency operator. You would then wait on the side of the road for hours until a mechanic drove out in a pickup truck with a 5-gallon can of gasoline. It was a premium service, and it was notoriously expensive. You weren't just paying for the gas, you were paying a heavy penalty for the mechanic's lost sleep. It was a deeply inefficient Band-Aid for a bleeding wound. Sensing this untapped market, a handful of independent station owners positioned along major commercial freight routes decided to take a gamble. They kept their pumps unlocked until midnight, hoping to capture the lucrative trucking traffic. But these pioneers immediately ran headfirst into a terrifying problem that no one had fully anticipated: crime. Think about the architecture of an early highway gas station. It was essentially a brightly lit glass box, sitting completely alone on a desolate, unpatrolled stretch of dark road. Inside that glass box was a solitary attendant holding a thick wad of cash in his pocket, alongside a manual cash register packed with the day's earnings. There were no closed-circuit security cameras, no silent alarms, and certainly no bulletproof transaction windows. To a desperate criminal, an isolated gas station at midnight was quite literally a glowing treasure chest. Almost immediately, an epidemic of armed robberies swept through these late-night outposts. Working the night shift at a rural service station quickly became one of the most statistically dangerous jobs in the country. A string of high-profile, violent holdups in the Midwest made local headlines, sending a chilling message to any station owner thinking about extending their hours. Why risk your life, or the lives of your employees, for a few extra gallons of nighttime sales? And this is where things get really interesting. You might assume that the massive oil conglomerates, behemoths like Standard Oil, Gulf, and Sinclair, were greedily pushing their stations to stay open and capitalize on this nocturnal demand. But the reality was the exact opposite. Big Oil actively and aggressively fought against the concept of the late-night gas station. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, these corporations had spent millions of advertising dollars carefully cultivating a pristine, wholesome, family-friendly image. They wanted their branded stations to be viewed as respectable pillars of the community, safe places where a traveling family could use clean restrooms and receive cheerful professional service. Corporate executives in high-rise boardrooms were absolutely terrified of the night. They firmly believed that operating after dark would automatically attract the wrong element: vagrants, drunks, and armed robbers. They viewed late-night operations as seedy hangouts that would permanently tarnish their carefully manufactured corporate prestige. In fact, many regional managers actively penalized franchise owners who tried to keep their lights on too late, threatening to pull their branding if they didn't adhere to respectable business hours. The industry was actively fighting its own consumer base. The friction was unbearable. On one side, you had a rapidly modernizing public, flush with post-war cash, demanding the freedom to travel whenever they pleased. On the other side, you had a stubborn corporate machine terrified of crime and fiercely protective of its wholesome image, alongside independent owners who simply wanted to go home to their families at dinner time. It was an absolute stalemate. The gap between what the American driver needed and what the oil industry was willing to provide grew wider and more volatile with every passing month. Something had to break. But it wasn't going to be a simple change of heart in a corporate boardroom, and it wasn't going to be driven by local station owners. It was going to take the largest, most expensive public works project in the history of human civilization to finally shatter the dawn-to-dusk curfew and force the lights on for good. The stalemate between desperate drivers and stubborn oil executives was finally broken in the summer of 1956, and it was broken by a man who had been harboring a deep personal vendetta against American roads for decades. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had two defining life experiences that completely reshaped his view of transportation. Back in 1919, as a young Army officer, he participated in a transcontinental military convoy. It took them 62 agonizing days to cross the United States, dragging heavy equipment through mud, collapsed wooden bridges, and unpaved dirt trails. Decades later, during World War II, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower saw the German Autobahn. He witnessed a seamless, high-speed concrete network that could move troops and supplies across a massive country with terrifying efficiency. He realized that America's fragmented, crumbling, daytime-only road network wasn't just a frustrating inconvenience for commuters. It was a glaring national security liability. So, on June 29, 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. It was, at the time, the largest single public works project in human history. The legislation authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, fueled by a staggering initial appropriation of $25 billion. But this wasn't just about paving over dirt roads. The interstate system completely rewired the geographic DNA of the country. These new highways were designed for continuous, high-speed travel. There were no stoplights. There were no railroad crossings. And crucially, they completely bypassed the main streets of small-town America. You could now drive from New York all the way to Chicago without ever stopping at a town square or navigating a local commercial district. This brilliant feat of engineering inadvertently created an absolute logistical nightmare for the night driver. Think about it. If you were driving on a traditional rural route in 1950 and your engine died, you could usually walk a mile or two, find a local farmhouse, or knock on the door of a sleeping mechanic. But if you are driving on a closed-loop interstate highway at 1 o'clock in the morning and your fuel gauge hits empty, you are entirely trapped. You are essentially sitting at the bottom of a concrete trench, surrounded by chain-link fences and steep embankments, miles away from civilization. There were no emergency phones, and wandering down a pitch-black, high-speed corridor was a guaranteed death sentence. The physical infrastructure had evolved to support endless, uninterrupted motion, but the fueling ecosystem was still stubbornly operating on the blacksmith's schedule. The massive oil corporations, the very same executives who had spent the last decade aggressively fighting against nighttime hours to protect their wholesome image, suddenly had a terrifying realization. The old model was completely dead. The traditional mom-and-pop service station sitting on Main Street was about to become entirely obsolete. The millions of cars zooming across Eisenhower's new concrete web were never going to exit the highway just to wander through a dark town looking for a locked Texaco station. The executives realized that whoever controlled the interstate off-ramps controlled the entire future of American travel. What followed was one of the most brutal and rapid corporate land grabs in American history. Companies like Standard Oil, Gulf, and Shell began quietly dispatching armies of real estate agents to buy up massive tracts of barren farmland located exactly at the newly plotted interstate interchanges. A desolate patch of dirt in rural Nevada or a swampy intersection in Ohio that was practically worthless in 1955 was suddenly selling for exorbitant, unprecedented sums by 1960. The oil giants were pouring tens of millions of dollars into acquiring these specific geographic choke points. But there was a massive catch to this aggressive expansion. Because the real estate at these prime off-ramps was so incredibly expensive to acquire and develop, the traditional business math no longer worked. How do you pay for the most expensive commercial real estate in the country when half your potential customers are driving through in the dead of night? A station owner could not afford to pay the mortgage on a premium interstate location if the pumps were padlocked for 12 hours a day. To justify the massive capital investment, these new highway stations absolutely had to generate revenue around the clock. They had to stay open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But here is the part that most people miss about this transition. You still could not afford to pay 3 men in crisp uniforms and bow ties to stand around shivering in the dark at 3 in the morning, waiting to check the oil of a passing trucker. The labor costs of the old full-service model would have immediately bankrupted these new locations. Solving this economic puzzle meant killing what made the service stations special. If the pumps were going to run all night, the oil companies had to remove the human element. The technology for self-service gas pumps had actually been invented back in the late 1940s, but it was heavily restricted, and in many states entirely outlawed, by strict fire marshals who believed untrained civilians would blow up their own neighborhoods. But now, with billions on the line, Big Oil brought their massive lobbying power down on state legislatures. Suddenly, the safety concerns evaporated. The fire codes were quietly rewritten. The burden of pumping hazardous, flammable liquid was officially shifted from the paid employee directly onto the customer. The 24-hour gas station was finally economically viable, but it came at a steep cost. The friendly local mechanic who knew your name and wiped your windshield was being aggressively replaced by a single, lonely cashier locked behind a pane of thick glass. The lights were finally on, but the warmth was gone. By the end of the 1960s, the glowing 24-hour sign was a permanent fixture on the American highway. The lonely cashier behind the thick glass became the new normal, and the country had seemingly won its long battle against the sun. The rigid dawn-to-dusk curfew was dead. You could fuel up a Ford Mustang at 4 in the morning in the middle of the Nevada desert or halfway across the Ohio Turnpike. But just as the driving public settled into this ultimate, uninterrupted convenience, the entire system violently collapsed. In October of 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced a total oil embargo against the United States. It was direct retaliation for American involvement in the Yom Kippur War, and it hit the domestic economy like a localized earthquake. Practically overnight, the global price of oil quadrupled, rocketing from roughly $3 a barrel to nearly $12. The seemingly endless river of cheap fuel that powered Eisenhower's new interstate highway system instantly dried up. Those massive, multi-million-dollar 24-hour stations that Big Oil had just spent a decade building at every highway off-ramp were suddenly useless. Their massive underground storage tanks were bone dry. Instead of pulling in for a quick midnight fill-up, American drivers were lining up for miles in the freezing cold. Commuters sat idle in their vehicles for 3 or 4 hours just to buy a strictly rationed 3 gallons of gas. Fights broke out at the pumps. States had to implement odd-even rationing systems based on the last digit of your license plate just to manage the sheer public panic. The federal government stepped in and actually mandated weekend closures to conserve what little fuel was left. The shiny new neon canopies were switched off. The country was plunged right back into the dark ages of fueling. When the embargo was finally lifted in early 1974, the psychological damage was permanent. The retail oil industry had learned a brutal, unforgettable lesson. Selling gasoline was an incredibly volatile, low-margin nightmare. You simply could not rely on the sale of petroleum alone to keep a massive commercial property running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If the wholesale price of oil spiked even a few cents, A station owner's profit margin was instantly wiped out. To survive the unpredictable, wild swings of the global energy market, the American gas station had to fundamentally mutate. And this is where the grand illusion of the modern American road trip truly begins. Station owners realized that they had a completely captive audience. If someone is stopping for gas at 2 in the morning, they are probably exhausted, they are definitely hungry, and they have absolutely nowhere else to go. So, the stations began aggressively expanding their footprints. Think about the architecture of an older neighborhood gas station. It usually had 2 large roll-up garage doors on the side where a local mechanic would do oil changes, replace fan belts, and rotate tires. In the late 70s and early 80s, those mechanic bays were permanently bricked up. The greasy maintenance pits were filled in with solid concrete. In their place, owners installed sprawling, brightly lit retail floors. They brought in massive, humming walk-in refrigerators to hold beer and soda. They installed rows of industrial coffee machines, microwave ovens, and heated metal rollers for mystery meats. They stopped being fueling stations and transformed into aggressive convenience stores that just happened to have gas pumps sitting out in the parking lot. Fast forward to the present day, and that transformation is absolute. When you pull your car into a modern 24-hour station, you are participating in a brilliantly disguised economic bait and switch. According to data from the National Association of Convenience Stores, roughly 80% of a modern station's actual profit comes directly from inside the store. It comes from the sugary energy drinks, the stale donuts, and the overpriced phone chargers. The actual gasoline flowing into your tank is practically a financial afterthought. Once you factor in the massive swipe fees taken by credit card companies on every transaction, a station owner might only take home 2 or 3 cents of pure profit on a single gallon of gas. The fuel is essentially a heavily subsidized loss leader. It is a necessary evil. It is a glowing, low-margin lure designed for one specific purpose: to force you to park your car, walk through those sliding glass doors, and purchase a bag of chips or a bottle of purified tap water that has been marked up by 300%. The oil giants figured out that the real money wasn't in conquering the night with petroleum. The real money was in creating an unavoidable, brightly lit trap for the exhausted midnight traveler. We conquered the night. We paved over the terrifying darkness with 41,000 miles of concrete and lit it up with thousands of glowing, heavily branded canopies. The rigid dawn-to-dusk curfew that dictated American life for generations is completely dead. But in doing so, we completely altered our relationship with travel, with the physical landscape, and with each other. Think about what we actually traded away to get to this point. We traded the genuine human connection of the old mom-and-pop service station, a place where a local mechanic knew your name, checked your engine belts, and safely sent you on your way. We traded that for cold, automated efficiency. We no longer have to rely on the fragile kindness of a local farmer waking up at 2 in the morning to help a stranded traveler. We do not have to nervously navigate small, unlit towns with a glass jar of volatile gasoline in the trunk, praying we find a safe haven before the sun disappears. We just rely on a digital credit card reader and a solitary, exhausted cashier hidden behind 2 inches of bulletproof plexiglass, surrounded by a dozen security cameras. That brilliantly lit gas station canopy, sitting completely alone at 3 o'clock in the morning, is perhaps the ultimate metaphor for modern American life. It is an artificial oasis of pure, undeniable convenience, sitting in a desolate desert of asphalt. It provides exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, but it completely isolates you in the process. You pull your car into the empty lot, you pump your own heavily subsidized fuel in total silence, You walk inside to buy your 300% marked up bottle of water, and you leave without ever speaking a single meaningful word to another human being. We demanded the absolute freedom to never stop moving. We hated the idea that the setting sun could dictate our schedules, so we ripped up the entire retail fueling infrastructure of the country to ensure the neon signs never turned off. And we got exactly what we asked for. But when you look at the massive, sprawling, lonely interstate system we built to achieve that absolute convenience, you have to ask yourself a serious question. Are we actually more connected to each other now that we can cross the entire continent in the dead of night? Or are we all just moving a lot faster through the dark? If that journey through the dark history of the American highway made you look at your next midnight fill-up a little differently, hit that subscribe button. On this channel, we dive into the hidden machinery of the world around us. We break down the strange histories, the forgotten crises, and the massive financial forces that quietly built the everyday things you take for granted. I want to hear from you down in the comments. Have you ever found yourself completely stranded or running out of gas in the middle of nowhere? What did you do? Share your story below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.